Now it's time to take a look through the business pages of the Sunday papers. This morning we've got Labour donor John Mills with us and Rita Clifton, who's the chairman of BrandCap. So welcome to both of you. Now, what have you found? Rita, you found in the Sunday Times a story about Apple Music.
Indeed. Well, this is the big and mighty Apple, knowing no bounds. This is the world's most valuable brand, and it's going to launch its own competitor to Spotify tomorrow. This is Apple Music. This is a music streaming service. And also in another paper, Apple Pay is preparing to launch in the UK in the summer.
And this is in the Sunday Telegraph, isn't it? They've got that story.
Exactly.
So what's Apple Pay?
Well, Apple Pay is basically a contactless payment system. This is just another example where Apple is fantastically good at recognising when a market has been developed and they can come in and do it better. I mean, Apple are brilliant at wrapping themselves around people's lives. I mean, we're increasingly living Apple lives. I mean, I just, the other day I went in to get an Apple Watch. They want to try it on you, and then if you're very, very lucky, they'll deign to sell you one. I mean, this is an extraordinary company, and every year people say, is this the last of Apple? Is it going to fade? And everything else, and it just keeps on getting bigger and better.
Very successful brand, but I mean, they're known for innovation, aren't they? Is this kind of copycatting other people's ideas, though? Is this a new move for them?
Oh, I'm not sure I agree with the word copycat.
No,
that's really absolutely, but they definitely do. They look at markets and they think, how can Apple do it better? How can they do it better in a more human way? Because they are brilliant at designing things for human beings, for people's lives. They've got a very clear point of view about what they're about. And as I say, they apply that to every market. They are not category bound in the slightest, like lots and lots of businesses are. So I'm really interested to see what they're going to carry on doing next, because as I say, people keep on predicting this is going to be the moment of fade. And yet again, they've done something really interesting.
Well, who knows? Certainly their competitors will hope that they trip up somewhere along the line,
Indeed.
won't they? John, take us to your first story that you've picked out, a story focusing on George Osborne.
Yes, this is about pressure from HSBC to reduce the bank levy that they're going to have to pay. And they are threatening to move their business, or the headquarters of their business anyway, to Hong Kong. And I think this is part of the saga of British banks and the relationship that the government has with them, and indeed with the customers too. There doesn't seem to be a huge focus here on looking after customers in the UK better, and I think this has been an enormous failure of the clearing banks over a long period of time. There's huge pressure from inside HSBC to improve their performance, to get a higher return on the capital they've got, and they're now talking about divesting operations all over the place in South America and in Turkey and elsewhere, and very substantially reducing the number of staff. But I think to some extent the big message in all this is what's happening to the centre of gravity economically in the world. And the HSBC, if it moves away from the UK, will move to Hong Kong. And I think this says a large amount about how much better the East is doing than the West, and how things are going to develop over the next 5 or 10 years.
So do you think that if they did move, it would be because that's where they see future profits lying, and it's not because of the bank levy? Do you think, how much do you think it would be that would drive them?
Well, the bank levy is quite a large sum of money. I mean, it's hundreds of millions of pounds, but I mean, the revenues of HSBC are enormous. The company's worth 120 billion pounds or something, a huge sum of money. So probably the levy in itself is not the determining factor. I suspect it's much more where the future lies and where the profitability will be, where the growth in depositors are going to be, and that's really where the Hong Kong scores over London, unfortunately.
And do you think now that Britain's attitudes towards the banks feels about fair? There was a feeling for a long time that bankers had it too good. Do you feel now that the level of taxation aimed at them and the level of regulation is about right, so that the city can thrive but also the customers don't lose out?
Well, I think the trouble really is that the banks have taken a tremendous battering over the last few years, partly with levies, but partly also with fines. I mean, the trouble with the banking system is that, you know, we keep thinking we've got to the end of all the scandals that have been, and then another lot come along, and HSBC have had a fair share of these, and so have other banks too. And I think confidence in the banking system generally is at a very low ebb and evidently needs to be restored. But I mean, this is partly banks doing a better job for customers in the UK as well as other things, and I don't think they've done a very good job there either.
OK, let's move on to The Observer, Rita, because you've picked out a story here about advertising.
Well, it's a story about advertising, but above all, it's on the millions front. This is a story about Sir Martin Sorrell's pay packet, which is a cool £43 million. So it is astonishing. This is a hoary subject. It's also a very contentious subject because, of course, you could argue, you know, WPP is a company that employs something like 180,000 employees, which is just about similar to the number of times, 179 times more than the average employee is what his package is. Now, if you compare that, though, with, for example, the highest paid US executive, which is something like $285 million, I mean, obviously, you know, these things are in proportion. And it just does seem like an extraordinary and eye-popping amount of money, except if you put it against some of the wealth that he's created. And it just made me feel how important it is that business leaders explain to people how it is that wealth creation works. Because actually, if you just look at the amount of value that, you know, WP has created over time, it is extraordinary, and yet the absolute amount is absolutely
Do you agree with that, given the context that it's a fair amount, £43 million?
I must say, I think business leaders have been too greedy about helping themselves to too much. I mean, I do agree Martin Sorrell's done a fantastically good job with his company. But if you look at much of the rest of the world, outside the United States and the UK, the ratio between the pay of the top executives and the employees is much, much lower than it is. So the idea that you have to pay these people these astronomical sums of money, I don't think is correct. And I think there's too much of a culture where people running very large organisations think they're entitled to help themselves.
Well, you see, what's very interesting, though, is that, you know, consumers are the ones who are going to apply pressure, and of course shareholders too. I mean, there's a lot more shareholder activism these days when it comes to executive remuneration. So shareholders are pushing harder and harder for making sure executives look as though they're worth the money that they are getting paid. But at the end of the day, if companies don't satisfy their customers, if they're not doing the right thing for customers and building long-term relationships, then, you know, they're going to lose those customers, and the company's going to lose value, and people are going to lose jobs. So there is a kind of democracy at work here, a commercial democracy at work. But all the same, it's extremely difficult for people to look at this and feel calm and rational about it.
OK, let's turn our attention now, John, to some of the Europe stories that are dominating the headlines on the front pages. We've got front pages for both the Observer and the Sunday Telegraph. The Sunday Telegraph being the group of 50 Tory MPs who are starting a group to put extra pressure on the Prime Minister to get concessions out of Europe.
Well, I think what we ought to try and do is to get the best deal we can out of Europe, and also do it in a way which is good for Europe as well. I don't think we should just be sort of little Englanders batting for our own interests without looking at the wider context. But I do think that some of the approaches that have been taken by people who say we want to stay in the European Union, irrespective of what happens in the negotiating process, are not really being very helpful. I think there's a real danger that we're going to finish up by having a referendum in a year or two's time with very little in the way of concessions. And this is just going to do nothing really to solve the issue, and the Euroscepticism will still be there. I think we need more fundamental change before a proper decision can be taken. If
the referendum was tomorrow, how would you vote?
Well, at the moment, I'd be in favour of voting out, but I'm open-minded about what happens in the renegotiation. If that's satisfactory enough, I'd be very happy to stay in. I think that's really where the British people want to be. They want to stay in the European Union, but on better terms.
So how should Labour handle this? You're a donor to Labour. You would vote out instinctively at the moment unless things change. So how should the party deal with this? We've seen these 50 Tory MPs grouping themselves together at the moment. How much division is there within Labour, and how should they handle it?
Well, I think there is quite a lot of division in Labour as to whether the party should start campaigning now to stay in, or whether that Labour should play a really active part in the renegotiation process. I think very strongly they should do the latter, because I think that by campaigning to stay in, irrespective of what the renegotiation brings, is likely to help the people who want very little change to be successful. And the outcome then is going to be a referendum which isn't really going to settle the issue, because there won't be a choice between a really radical change and coming out, which I think is what we really need.
And is there a particular leader that you would back, that you think would make your view heard better than others? Are you backing one particular leadership candidate?
I'm really listening to what all of them have got to say at the moment on this and other issues before making up my mind.
there's no one in particular that you're focused on at the moment, that you can't give me a name?
I can't give you a name, I'm sorry, but I will be able to give you a name when I listen to what they've all got to say.
We'll have you back next week and we'll question you a little bit further. Rita, do you have a word to say on Europe, or should we move on to your next story in the Telegraph?
Well, I think we belong in Europe. You know, it's such an important thing for businesses to be in Europe and to be able to trade freely and so on. And you know, I think we've seen the result of the brinkmanship that's been going on so many issues and topics in the world. I mean, you know, if I hear Grexit or indeed Brexit once more, I think we're all going to be looking forward to the time then, you know, that has gone past. So, you know, the price of brinkmanship sometimes is not very desirable for businesses nor indeed for populations. So it would be very nice if we try and negotiate this in a civilised fashion and be a great example for the rest of the world. But anyway, there we are, talking about the rest of the world. There was an article on Lenovo, which actually is in the Observer. Sorry, I think actually this is the Telegraph, in fact. It's an article on Lenovo, because a new boss has taken over the Chinese brand Lenovo in Europe. And it just reminds you of just how ambitious Chinese-based businesses are to expand over the world, and not just expand in basic business terms, but also expand in building their brands. I mean, there are about 6 Chinese brands in the top 100 across the average league tables and so on these days. And again, they're ambitious to grow, they're ambitious to acquire businesses, they're ambitious to acquire the brand names of those businesses and the knowledge of those businesses, because that's how they think they're going to grow and generate sustainable value. Because, of course, you need to build a brand to generate real sustainable value, because they're the sustainable assets you've got. So fascinating how ambitious they're being and taking on these companies, and fascinating what their preoccupations are, and a real threat, actually, to many businesses who are competitors around the world.
Well, I think that's right, but I think also there's been a huge trend towards selling British assets. Companies, I mean, of all the larger manufacturing companies, I think 2/3 of them are now owned abroad. We sold off hundreds of billions of pounds worth of assets in the last few years to sustain the balance of payments deficit we've got. And it does seem to me that this is a real rate of progress that we're involved in, that there are enormous dangers about financing standard living beyond what we can really afford by selling off assets all over the place, which is very much where we are at the moment.
But you know, I'm so proud of Britain as being a free market where people can come and do business, and of course there, you know, there's a bit of give and take going on there too. And I guess if we are selling off businesses, it generates a decent capital gain, and that goes, I hope, into reinvestment. But what it does show is that we've got to be very ambitious to grow businesses, to grow great world-class brands, and for there to be a great canal of opportunities that are going to come through on the world stage. And we do need to make sure that British businesses are creating more and more strong businesses and strong brands, because it is true, we do tend to sell them off. So it sort of goes both ways, doesn't it?
But if you sell off £100 billion worth of businesses every year, which is what we've been doing, and the return on those businesses is 5%, the balance of payments goes down the drain by £5 billion every year. In 5 years, it goes down by £25 billion. Is this really a sustainable
It's a very demanding replacement strategy we've got to have, absolutely.
OK, we must leave it there. John Mills and Rita Clifton, good to see you. Thanks very much indeed for guiding us through the business pages of the papers. We appreciate it. You're watching Monaghan on Sky News. Coming up.